Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
What's the weirdest thing you saw outdoors? Back in high school, I spent a long day walking the railroad tracks with one of my friends, all stand by me. His little brother was home alone playing video games, but he can look after himself. He was maybe 12. Anyway, we were out for like 3 hours and started hearing this smashing sound in the woods near the tracks. We snuck over and peeked through the thick bushes and saw my friend's brother destroying a car. In the woods. With a splitting maul. A couple hours later we got home and he was still sitting playing video games like he never left. Turns out it was a neighbor's car. It was stolen and driven down a dirt road a few miles away, and totaled with a splitting maul they had in the trunk. We never turned him in, but I kept my distance from that psycho from then on.
Was getting drunk with some buddies in the woods in Ontario. 2 hours from closest city. 30 minutes from closest town. About an hour walk in the bush at a camp. Hunting blind we built. 12 p.m. and ready to start walking back with some beers and cigarettes to keep us going. As we pack up, we hear the sound of what I could only describe as a decent-sized branch. Wood hitting a tree close by to us at uneven intervals, and it was hitting hard enough to echo. Walked with the safety off on the rifle on the way back home. Was only a .22 though. Made the hair on my neck stand up, and I can still remember the feeling of uncertainty. Screw whatever that was.
I saw a raven doing mathematics in the snow one time. That's the weirdest thing I ever saw in the wilderness or anywhere. There was a raven that was using the surface of the perfectly flat snow at the edge of a lake to draw a large grid on the surface with its feet. It was about a 4 by 4 feet area, and there was a grid with squares about 3 feet lined into the surface of the snow. The only explanation I can think up for a raven doing something like that is because it was using it for writing, trying to draw a calendar or derive the Pythagorean theorem maybe.
A new set of stairs about 11 miles into the woods while backpacking. I off-roaded about 25 or 26 miles to get to the edge of the forest too. Another time in a different place I saw something with elk or deer antlers walking on all 4 legs, then it stood up on a ridgeline maybe a mile away, then looked around and started walking standing up in my direction as though it saw me. Ran away that time and never went back there. Forest kinda stopped making noise while I was running, had an odd ozone smell, and I heard things. I swear as I was driving away I saw it standing looking at me too.
I was lost in a woods with a friend for about 10 hours. We came to this little weird clearing about the size of a house that had a round rock about the size of a small car in the middle. We both thought it was a strange clearing and stood around in the clearing for about 30 to 45 minutes figuring what to do, and it was getting near dusk. I said a prayer even though I wasn't really religious, and instantly both me and my friend saw a very obvious opening in the clearing that went to a path and then to a road. We both remarked how weird that was because the clearing was so small and we were in it for a good while, so we would have obviously seen it if it had been there before. It kind of makes me feel bad that I'm not religious when I think about it.
Saw 2 dead decomposing sheep in Dartmoor, right next to the path. There's tons of sheep up in the moors, but they have no natural predators and are surrounded by food and water. 1 sheep dying of something natural would make sense, but 2 laying dead about 15 feet from each other seemed odd. At the time we assumed it was 2 rams who headbutted each other to death and died quickly after their fight, but there's no way farmers let prized rams run about in the moors with all the ewes and lambs, so as it stands, 2 dead decomposing female sheep dead a couple of feet apart, right next to the path. Surrounded by grass and water. Strangely enough, not very spooky at all despite having the most hostile climate. Sudden fog, 10-meter deep bogs covered with thin grass, so you might just fall in and no one will see you go. Absolute dogshit weather and wind, and a bajillion cryptids and legends. Also lots of old broken apart buildings almost completely collapsed with the pitch black cellar entrances still remaining. I wanted to stay in it for the night, but my girlfriend found it too spoopy. Also a couple of years back went on a 3-day stay. Went to a campsite close to Fife with girlfriend, best friend and his girlfriend. The owner was a bit of a weird guy but repaired old motorcycles, so I found him cool, but apparently everyone else found him creepy. There were no animal or bird sounds the entire 3 days. Both girls felt really bad vibes from one of the cabins on the site and refused to go near it. My friend heard something following him going out for a piss. I personally didn't have any bad experience but felt anxious the entire time. There was a major road that ran relatively close by, although you couldn't hear it at the campsite. My personal theory is that the sound from the road scared away all the wildlife, and our group's monkey brains were all subconsciously on high alert due to lack of wildlife sounds being equated with predators in the vicinity.
Myself and 2 friends walking down an empty road out in really rural Pennsylvania, staying at some shitty camp spot full of RVs, dead of night, sun-dried corn stalks in all directions. Specifically just to talk and look at the sky, maybe see something spook. We had no alcohol or weed and we were bored enough to just go do this. All 3 of us stopped dead mid-step as if on command, staring at a branch in the road with some wooden fence. Red orbs, an effect similar to a red reflector on a bike, weaving in and around the fence and then fading out like candlelight. And then what I can only describe as an overwhelming deafening sound of a toilet flushing or just immeasurable volumes of water moving into empty space. All-consuming sound, and paralyzing fear between all 3 of us. None of us took a single step between the red orbs and the sound. All 3 of us were frozen, unable to speak or cover our ears, the sound coming from all directions at once. Imagine the most primal flight response your brain can register for several seconds on end, but you can't move, you can't think about moving. All sensory input is consumed by this sound of rushing water, all brain function trying to make sense of it. And then it went dead silent and all 3 of us glanced at each other in the eyes for about half a second just to make sure we all just experienced that, and we all sprinted what must have been a mile back to where the campsite was at. The more normie of the 3 of us went to sleep and swore to God he didn't remember anything the next morning, but me and the other guy spent the next 2 hours trying to find a single example of any of this shit happening in Pennsylvania to no avail. First and last unexplainable thing, save for creepy caches of kids' toys or kids' clothes in the woods I've come across many times camping as a kid.
About 6 friends and I were 17 or 18 and bored with nothing to do one winter, so we drove down this old hiking area and walk out there at night after it quit raining. We walk a couple of miles in and hear a lot of noise of a camp in a clearing and stalk and crawl up to it. The camp is a bunch of Confederate Civil War reenactors with a campfire. And those big canvases that have straight sides. They even had a guard patrol working the area, but they were just doing it to screw around and not paying attention because my friends and I ain't that stealthy. One of my friends signaled to follow him and we crawled to the tents and he started stealing the stakes and laying them down except for the door part of the tents near the fire. They didn't notice and we snuck off. Then one guy got found by the guard and taken back to their camp. The guy that got said they reenactors didn't notice the tents were down and they gave him some pizza and he hung out a bit before they walked him back to the road. Guy with the stealing idea is now a Baptist preacher. Guy that got caught became an Army Ranger and has been doing contracting in some crap hole country for about 12 years.
I don't know what I saw. It was a very dark night, so take this with a grain of salt. Be about 16. Me, my cousin, and our friend are farting around in the woods with lightsabers meant for combat reenactment. These woods have a few ghost stories surrounding them, but we'd been hanging out there even at night for years and never seen anything or even felt afraid. Usually would be smoking weed but bone sober this night because we couldn't find any. Go deeper into the woods than we usually do, looking for this particular clearing by a very small pond because it has a level sandy shore, so less likely to trip over tall grasses while roughhousing. Somehow get turned around even though the pond isn't far. These woods don't have proper trails and I guess we must have stepped off it somehow. Realize we are having to force our way through underbrush and decide to turn back. Start feeling uneasy for some reason. Find our way to the main path and get to small pond, farting around with lightsabers and having fun. Uneasy feeling forgotten. We are taking a small break and my cousin points out a shadow darker than its surroundings at the edge of the clearing. This is where it gets really weird. We agree in whispers that it looks like some kind of animal and then it sort of grows. Like stands up on its hind legs maybe. Nope, out of there. .jpg. We run back to original grassy clearing and sort of laugh it off. It was dark, probably just a black bear or something. Resume having fun for about 15 to 20 minutes and then take another break. I notice the shadow is now at the entrance of this clearing, just like before, but there is less tree cover here and through the sliver of moonlight we can clearly see that it's a humanoid shape squatting down. No light reflecting off of it, but the leaves and branches around it were more illuminated, so it had a more defined silhouette, if that makes sense. It stands up and takes a step towards us, making no noise on the dead leaves. WGTFO.
Back when I was a young teenager, I lived with my parents in the country. We were surrounded by cow pastures mixed with groves of trees. I would often go walking by myself and could walk for a few miles behind our house without crossing near another house. One day I set out for a walk and noticed a line cut into the ground. The line was cleanly cut and very straight, about what you might see if an axe were partially stuck in the dirt and carefully dragged along. Clearly no animal could cut something this pristine. Although there were no visible tire tracks nor was the surrounding grass perturbed, I still figured it must have been done by some kind of machinery. Since the line was going in the direction of my travel, I decided to follow it. When I reached the barbed wire fence that marked the back boundary of my father's property, I was shocked to see that the line continued right under the fence without stopping. At that point, I realized it was very unlikely to have been made by a machine. I crossed over the fence and continued following the line for about another 50 feet where it abruptly stopped at a completely arbitrary spot in the pasture. Interestingly, another similar line crossed it at a 90-degree angle, although not right at the very end of the first line. There were a few inches of overhang. This second line appeared to go for quite some distance, but I decided I'd check it out later on the way back, but I never did or don't remember doing it. Another time, I found similar cuts in the ground but much further away from our property, but with similar random placement. Anyway, not much else to say about it, but I never figured out who or what made the lines. I can only assume they were made using some hand tool and likely with great physical effort, but for what purpose? Decades later, I still have no idea.
Didn't happen to me, but a woman told us about the time someone chased her through the woods. Dusk was approaching and the trail was starting to get dark, so she went to fish her headlamp out of her pack and noticed someone with a flashlight further down the trail. They were just standing there, which creeped her out. She got her headlamp on and started walking briskly down the trail. When she looked back, she could see the other person with the flashlight was keeping pace with her. She started walking faster and getting to a clearing, dashed across it. Looking back at the clearing, she could see that the person following her was standing at the edge of it but wouldn't step out into the clearing. She hoped that was the end of it, but as she went down the trail more, the next time she looked back, she could see the flashlight of the person who was following her down the trail again. So they must have waited for her to get down the trail a bit before crossing the clearing. She started running, came to another clearing and halfway across it, stumbled. By now it was dark and she was scared the person chasing her was going to take advantage of her fall. She quickly turned off her headlamp and crawled into the brush, looking back at where the trail opened to the clearing. She could see the light, but it looked like the person had climbed a tree, maybe to search for her. After a few more panicked moments, she realized it wasn't a flashlight. It was the moon rising. There never had been anyone behind her. She freaked herself out. Lesson, boys and girls, is that there's nothing scary in the woods and you shouldn't be afraid to come out here alone. Everything will be all right. There's nothing dangerous that you can't handle. Come on out tonight.
I don't know if this counts, but it's some existential creepiness. I explore ruined chapels, churches, and abbeys here in Ireland with my dad to record them before they disappear forever. Just as a hobby. Most are just shells of tiny country chapels. Some are huge crumbling abbeys and monastic sites. They're usually out in the middle of nowhere, out in the country or in farmers' fields, open to the sometimes harsh elements. Wearing down walls and gravestones. The ground is almost always overgrown, especially in the untouched ones the Office of Public Works never got around to. Covered in leaves, twigs, vines, and sometimes broken glass in charred places where youths burned fires. While my dad is off taking pictures of the exterior of the place and such, I stand in the shell of the place under the open sky. Ceiling long vanished or some small, cloistered room, and think that at one point several hundred years ago, somebody long dead, who I'll never know, stood here going about their daily life or praying. Someone probably sat in this place where a pew used to be, someone who might very well be buried in the adjacent graveyard, or gone forever. Somewhere else. People who would never have conceived that I would be standing in their place. Long after the place had fallen into ruin and was all but forgotten, taking pictures and thinking about them. It's really eerie to me.
B15. Be on camping trip with older brother and dad in Sweden. It's kind of a book trip, where you get food and a canoe and get sent off onto a huge lake that is rather narrow, but really long and is branched dozens of times. Has tons of islands in the lake as well. Is a week-long trip. There are some brown bears around that area, so we usually camp on islands. Last night before we have to make our way back to the starting point. On an island we haven't been before, that is 50 meters away from the nearest shore at least in every direction. Island itself is about 20 by 20 meters. Set up our camp, 2 tents, me and my bro in one, dad in the other. About half an hour after we go to sleep, completely dark outside. Start to hear splashing sounds as if something is in the water. Can't really imagine a moose or bear being this far out in a lake. Splashing sounds get louder, you can tell by movement you hear, that this has to be as big as a human at least. Ask brother and dad what they think. Dad tells me to be quiet, seems a bit alarmed. Splashing sounds go on for a few minutes, getting louder, then quieter and louder again. Then I hear the most scaring sound I have ever heard in my life, the sound of something large stepping on ground, breaking sticks and dried leaves, followed by branches snapping. About 10 meters away from our tents. Dad yells at us to make noise and starts screaming himself. Me and my bro join him screaming. We stop after about a minute. Can't hear anything now. Everybody is listening tensely. Then we hear something big rushing into water. Splashing sounds return and faint into silence after a few minutes. I know this wasn't something paranormal, but it was still scary, considering that no one could really explain what would be so far out in a lake.
About 12 years ago I was hunting in the woods near my home. I was 12 or 13 at the time and was familiar with most of the woods. But hunting wasn't going so well in my usual spots, so I decided to try some places that I have never gone. I kept pushing through the thickest brush to try and kick something up till I ended up in a new clearing. In the distance I could see a shambled barn about ready to fall down and an old 2-story farmhouse that had vines growing all over it. I decided to go closer to check out the buildings. When I approached the home it was clear that no one had lived in the home for decades. I tried to open the large front door but it was locked, so I tried to look around for another way in. When I circled around the house I noticed a hole that must have been an old basement entrance. I entered through the hole thinking that there may be something awesome left in the hose that I had to see. However, even with the daylight outside I couldn't see my hands in front of me with how dark the basement was. Moving around was becoming difficult as the floor was almost like a bog with thick mud. After a while in the dark my imagination was starting to get the better of me. I was hearing the slightest sound as something that may want to kill me. I about had enough and was getting ready to just head back towards the light beaming down from the hole I came in from. Then I noticed a trickle of light ahead. I reached forward and felt a wooden ladder. I was able to carefully climb up it, making sure that I didn't break any of the old rungs. When I reached the top there was a door that I lifted. Finally climbing into the house I realized that I was in an old kitchen. There seemed to be nothing but old jars and pots that looked about rusted through and some butcher knives and cleavers hanging above a tub sink, but I was still letting my imagination get the best of me. In my mind it felt like someone was there watching me tapping as if waiting for me to move. Eventually, after looking around the kitchen I moved toward the den. Every step I took the tapping would get louder. The creaking in the house was almost like screams compared to the deathly silence. I entered the den heart racing, afraid and excited at the same time to see who was making that sound. But I look around and there is no one. The tapping continues much louder than ever before. I looked towards the fireplace and atop the mantel was an old perpetual motion clock still ticking. I laughed to myself, realizing that this is what was making the sound. I was somewhat surprised that it was still working. I continued to look through the room till I opened a drawer and found some old pictures. I assumed it would have been the family who owned the house. Looking through the pictures I noticed that some are of small children who are dressed in nice clothes and propped up in chairs or sleeping in a bed. The backs of these old pictures even had their birth and death dates. Later I realized that the practice of taking pictures of the dead was normal back then. However, at that moment the pictures refueled my imagination. What if these kids were killed, I thought to myself. I placed the pictures back down and thought that maybe now would be a good time to go. Then I heard a loud bang from upstairs. The sound shook me all the way down my spine. I ran towards the front door and tried to open it. Still the door was locked as I pulled frantically on the knob. Glancing over my shoulder I could see the stairs leading to the second floor were right behind me, however they have all fallen away due to years of rot. I finally was able to unhinge the lock and exit the house. I started down a path near the house, not even worrying about hunting anymore, just to go home. But right at the bottom of the hill I see a small cottage, more of a shack than a cottage really. Near it were gravestones. The gravestones were covered in vines and moss. Being curious as I was, I had to see the names on the stones. I noticed that the stones sat atop empty graves, so I had to lean to try and remove some of the vines to read the deeply faded stones. The recent rain, however, made the edge of the grave and I fell down into the hole. Now I am stuck in a grave. Trying to climb out, I grab onto the vines, yet all it does is pull them down with me. I look up at the stone and can now see the name on it. It's my last name. WTF. I was freaking out. I decided that since I had my gun, I would try to signal for help. My house wasn't that far away after all, and if my family heard gunshots being shot off like crazy, maybe someone would come. After shooting a few dozen rounds, I could hear my dad yelling. I started to yell back till he found me and helped me get out. I asked him what the hell is going on and why there is a grave in our woods and why it has our last name. He told me that our family has been here for a long time and hasn't just lived on one spot on the property. The house that I was in is where my great-grandma was raised, and the gravestones were from our old relatives. The reason they were empty was that the bodies were moved to new graves years ago when the house was abandoned. We went home, and years later the woods were bought by some housing developer and plowed over.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.